Hello, my friends. Vladimir Putin did something very characteristic before his state visit to India. He sat down with Indian media and laid out calmly and methodically how Moscow sees the conflict in Ukraine and the broader confrontation with the West. That alone already tells you something important. Russia is not acting like a country that feels cornered or ashamed. It is speaking to a major power like India as an equal, explaining its position, and signaling to the rest of the world that the Western narrative about this war is fundamentally dishonest. Let's start with a core claim Putin made. Russia did not start the war in Ukraine. According to Moscow, what started this entire chain of events was not some sudden Russian aggression, but a Western-sponsored regime change operation in Kyiv. The 2014 Maidan upheaval wasn't a spontaneous uprising of pure Democrats. It was a coup in which the West supported, facilitated, and organized the overthrow of a sitting government. After that, everything else followed. The upheaval in Crimea, the rebellion in Donbass, and ultimately the open war we see today. Crimea is the first critical piece. Western propaganda has hammered the phrase Russian annexation into the public mind, but that framing deliberately hides something essential. Moscow's position is that Crimea did not start this crisis, Crimea reacted to it. Once the constitutional order in Kyiv was broken by force, a part of the country that was overwhelmingly Russian in identity and Russian-speaking in daily life chose not to accept the new nationalist authorities. The people there held a referendum and voted to join the Russian Federation. Now, the West likes to pretend that the little green men who appeared in Crimea, armed men without insignia, proved that this was all some illegal Russian military takeover. Putin's defenders flip that argument on its head. They say, if we want to be legalistic, Western governments never admit who paid the Maidan snipers, who financed the protests, who was pulling the strings. They act as if none of that is provable. Fine, then apply the same logic. We can also say it is not formally proven whose soldiers those little green men were. What is clear is that they created the conditions for Crimeans to vote without chaos, without bloodshed, without civil war. They did not force people at gunpoint to vote to join Russia. They ensured that a population which no longer recognized Kyiv as legitimate could exercise self-determination in peace. And here is the key legal and moral point. When a central government comes to power through a coup, parts of the country have a right to determine their own future. You can walk through the UN Charter and all the caveats about territorial integrity and self-determination. But at a broad level, the principle is clear. If the constitutional order is broken by force in the capital, regions that reject that coup can choose a different path. Crimea did exactly that. From Moscow's perspective, it followed international law more faithfully than the people who toppled the government in Kyiv. After Crimea, attention shifted to the southeast of Ukraine, Donbass. For 8 long years, Russia tried, at least on paper, to handle the Donbass question by peaceful means. The Minsk agreements were supposed to be the mechanism: autonomy for Donetsk and Lugansk within Ukraine, constitutional changes, special status, and a political solution instead of a military one. Moscow agreed, Donbass leaders agreed, Kyiv put its signature on the documents, and European leaders acted as guarantors. Then, years later, those same Western leaders openly confessed that they never meant to implement Minsk. Merkel, Hollande, Poroshenko, and others admitted publicly that Minsk was a way to buy time to arm Ukraine, train its forces, and prepare it for a future confrontation with Russia. In other words, they used a peace agreement as a cover for war preparations. From a Russian or skeptical Western analyst's perspective, this is extraordinary. You don't have to speculate or spread conspiracy theories. You just have to quote what these leaders themselves said. They incriminated themselves. They admitted that what Moscow had been warning about for years was true. The West was not seeking peace, it was seeking advantage. And they were so arrogant, so sure of their own impunity, that they bragged about it afterward. That raises a simple question. Why would they confess? Did they think they were so far above moral judgment that it didn't matter? Were they trying to ease their own conscience to say, yes, we deceived and escalated, but at least we're honest about it now? Whatever the motive, the effect is the same. They validated the Russian narrative. The arguments that pro-Russian analysts make today are built, in part, on the words of Western politicians and former officials. They handed this pattern doesn't just exist in Ukraine. Over and over again, former intelligence officers, ex-officials, and retired agents in the West eventually talk. They admit covert actions, coup attempts, psychological operations, and destabilization campaigns from Latin America to the Middle East and beyond. After the damage is done, after people have died, they write memoirs or give interviews that confirm what was once dismissed as Russian propaganda. The Ukrainian case is simply the most recent and most blatant version of this pattern. Against that background, Putin's current stated aim in Ukraine is straightforward: protect Russian interests and protect the people living in the new regions, Donbass, and what he calls Novorossiya. When he uses the term Novorossiya, he's not talking about some vague imperial nostalgia. He's referring to a well-defined band of historically Russian lands running from Donbass along the Black Sea coast all the way toward Transnistria in Moldova, places like Mariupol, Melitopol, Kherson, Nikolaev, maybe even Odessa if it comes to that. Putin has repeatedly hinted that if Kyiv continues attacking Russian infrastructure and shipping, especially in the Black Sea, Ukraine may lose its access to the sea. In plain language, Russia may complete the liberation or capture of the entire coastal strip, leaving what's left of Ukraine landlocked. That is not a secret. It's been telegraphed openly enough that no one in Kiev or Brussels can claim surprise. The message from Moscow is, we will protect these regions and these people, and if you keep escalating, the map will change even more in our favor. Now, look at the Kyiv regime itself. From the Russian standpoint, you have a leadership whose legal mandate has expired, a president who no longer has democratic legitimacy, and a state that has driven itself into a demographic and economic catastrophe. Millions have left the country. Large swaths of land and infrastructure are being sold off or pledged to foreign interests for pennies on the dollar. Entire neighborhoods and assets are being snapped up by outside capital, while ordinary Ukrainians pay the price in blood. This leadership is trapped in a dead end. Putin himself said it. The authorities in Kyiv have driven themselves into a cul-de-sac. There is no room for real maneuver. On the battlefield, there is no way to reverse the strategic balance. Economically, Ukraine survives only on Western funding that is increasingly difficult to justify to frustrated taxpayers in Europe and the United States. The only initiative left to Kyiv is to cheer on the confiscation of Russian assets in the West funds. Moscow will eventually recover in kind through seizures of Western property or territory under Russian control. So what is the point of continuing? Every extra month of war does not bring Ukraine closer to victory. It brings it closer to exhaustion and partition. That's the harsh, cold reality. Analysts like me can at least say this. We warned from the beginning that this path was suicidal. We argued that there were reasonable terms on the table early on, and that rejecting them would lead to exactly what we're seeing now. Let's recall what Russia actually demanded. Moscow did not ask for regime change in Kyiv. It did not insist on carving up Ukraine from day one. In 2022, during the Istanbul talks, the Russian side was prepared to put the most contentious issues, like the final status of Donbass, aside. The key demand was simple and, from any great power perspective, logical. Ukraine must not join NATO. No foreign military alliance, no hostile bases, no missile systems parked in historically Russian regions right on Russia's border. This is not some bizarre, unique Russian neurosis. Ask yourself how Washington would react if Mexico joined a military bloc with Russia and China and started hosting joint bases along the Texas border. If Beijing and Moscow started staging military exercises in Baja California and Sonora, would the United States shrug and say, well, Mexico is a sovereign country, it can do what it likes? Of course not. We all know that. There are basic unwritten rules in geopolitics. You do not ring a major nuclear power with hostile alliances and then act offended when it pushes back. But that is exactly what NATO tried to do with Russia in Ukraine. Moscow was told in the 990 seconds that NATO would not expand eastward, and then watched the alliance move closer and closer, wave after wave. When Russia finally drew a clear red line over Ukraine, over territory that is historically Russian, heavily Russian-speaking, and strategically vital for access to the Black Sea, its warnings were ignored. And when Moscow responded, NATO pretended to be shocked. Even Ukrainian officials have admitted how reasonable some of Russia's early positions were. David Arakhamia, leader of Zelensky's own party faction, has publicly confirmed that during the Istanbul talks in 2022, the Russian proposals were not extreme, not maximalist. They could have formed the basis for a settlement, but Western powers told Kiev not to accept them, not to sign. So whose fault is it that the war dragged on? Who bears responsibility for the extra deaths, the additional destruction, the further loss of territory? From Moscow's viewpoint, Russia has consistently tried to exit the conflict on reasonable terms and has been blocked at every turn by the West. That's why there is such bitterness toward certain Russian figures who defected to the Western narrative at critical moments. They are seen as people who betrayed their own country precisely when Russia was being demonized and attacked despite having given its adversaries every opportunity for a negotiated outcome. All of this sits inside a larger strategic picture. Russia as a central pillar of the emerging multipolar world. China may be the economic engine, but Russia is the backbone in two crucial domains: energy and hard power. Countries like India, Iran, and others do not simply deal with Russia out of sentiment. They rely on Russian oil, gas, advanced air defense systems, fighter jets, tanks, and military technologies. India, for example, produces the T-90 tank, one of the best tanks in the world under license from Russia, and operates Russian-designed aircraft. When India has had problems in recent conflicts, it was often Western equipment that underperformed, not the Russian systems. Meanwhile, Europe has been busy sabotaging itself. Germany, once the industrial powerhouse of the continent, destroyed its own competitive advantage by cutting itself off from affordable Russian energy. Without that foundation, German industry is losing ground. Italy's economy increasingly leans on luxury goods whose underlying manufacturing often depends on Asian production chains, especially Chinese. Compare that to Russia, which sells things that are strategic and indispensable: energy, raw materials, critical military technologies. Those are the goods that decide whether a state remains sovereign or becomes dependent. That same strategic lens also applies to the information domain. Putin has warned that platforms like Telegram and other social networks are being used for psychological and information warfare, especially targeting young people. Here again, there is a balance to strike. Serious analysts are not calling for the elimination of free debate or genuine dissent. Open discussion is healthy and necessary in any society. But it's naive to pretend that major Western governments and their intelligence services don't weaponize media and social networks to destabilize adversaries. We've seen this movie before, from color revolutions to information campaigns that soften up a target before sanctions, coups, or even open war. So Russia's argument is simple. It needs to defend its information space just as it defends its territorial borders. That means distinguishing between individual citizens expressing critical opinions and orchestrated foreign campaigns that aim to fracture a society in the run-up to a political or military confrontation. The West is not going to voluntarily restrain its own information warfare tools. Therefore, countries like Russia have to build legal and technical defenses of their own. When you put all of this together, the Russian narrative becomes brutally clear. Since at least 2014, and in many ways since much earlier, Moscow has been consistent. It warned that NATO expansion toward Ukraine was unacceptable. It backed a negotiated framework in Minsk and watched the West treat that framework as a smokescreen. It came to the table again in Istanbul and saw its proposals vetoed, not by Kyiv, but by Western capitals. In parallel, it watched Western leaders brag about using peace deals to arm Ukraine and listened to them lecture the world about international law and territorial integrity while ignoring both whenever it suited them. The result is the war we see today, a war that, from Russia's standpoint, is not a war of choice, but a war forced upon it by Western duplicity and strategic blindness. The tragedy is that it didn't have to be this way. The West could have accepted a neutral Ukraine, could have acknowledged Russia's red lines, could have honored its own promises not to expand NATO. Instead, it chose escalation wrapped in hypocrisy. That's why so many outside the Western Bloc, India, large parts of the global South, much of the non-aligned world refuse to parrot Washington's talking points. They see what Russia is saying not as wild propaganda, but as a plausible account backed by confessions from Western leaders themselves. They understand that today it is Russia being encircled and demonized. Tomorrow, it may be them. In that sense, Putin's words to Indian media weren't just an interview. They were a message to the global majority. Russia will defend its interests and its people in Donbass and Novorossiya. It will not allow NATO to park a hostile military machine on its historic doorstep, and it will continue to expose the gap between the West's rhetoric and its behavior. The longer the West refuses to face these realities, the more Ukraine will suffer, and the more the eventual settlement will reflect Russia's terms, not Washington's illusions.